Hi, this is Boki, and today I am going to be reviewing the Crazy Rich Asians trilogy by Kevin Kwan. As you might expect from a trilogy, there are 3 books in this series. The first is Crazy Rich Asians, the second is China Rich Girlfriend, and the third is Rich People Problems. The first book follows Rachel, a Chinese-American econ professor at NYU who is about to go to Singapore to visit the family of her boyfriend Nick for the very first time. Nick has not told her that his family is obscenely wealthy, so she is in for a huge shock when she goes, as is his family, because they did not know that she existed until very shortly before this trip, and they are not necessarily very excited about her. The second and third books build out on this world and these characters. The second book focuses in a little bit more on Rachel's family, and the third book goes more into the secrets that are underlying Nick's family. While Rachel and Nick are the entry points to this world, there is a huge cast of characters in these books, all of whom have varying degrees of wealth and eccentricity, and they all have their own stories that get built out over this series. I read these books for the very obvious reason of the movie that's supposed to be happening soon. There had been a period of time where the movie had been announced, but it didn't have that much hype yet, where I saw the book in the library, I was really excited, I checked it out, but I didn't get time to read it. Then the trailer got released, and now there's like a bajillion holds on it, and it's like really like gonna take forever to get to read. So I felt very impatient and decided that I was just gonna buy the books from the bookstore and read it because I don't have time to waste. I wanted to know what was happening just based on the trailer alone. I am like a huge lover of like Real Housewives, and so I was really excited to get sort of that like voyeuristic insight into rich people's lives, but in a very different setting than I'm used to. And this is one of those books that's like really fun if you like that kind of thing. Like I also love like Gossip Girl and like Bergdorf Blondes, like those kinds of like, not just like snapshots of like rich people's lives, but kind of like a gossipy virtual reality of like obscene levels of wealth. And those kinds of books, one of the things that I especially love about them is reading descriptions of fashion, and that is a huge part of the Crazy Rich Asians trilogy as well. So that was so much fun for me to read. I almost wish there was like an illustrated section of this book where all the outfits that Kwan is describing are brought to life. That's definitely a part of the movie that I'm really excited for, just because I want to see pretty clothes in action. And I think the way that Kwan builds out the fashion in the book, it's indicative of what he's really good at in this book overall, which is painting really vivid pictures of different settings. You know, one chapter you might be in a New York cafe, and another chapter you might be at some like designer house in Paris, and another one you might be in a manor in Singapore, and then you're on a private jet. He's really taking you through all of these worlds that for most of us are both physically and financially inaccessible, and he makes them very, very vivid, but still makes them feel distant, which I think is a very impressive thing to be able to do. If you've been following me on Twitter, you've probably seen me get increasingly obsessed with the series, and it's just because it's so much fun to engage with this world where it feels like anything is possible. On top of that, Kwan is not afraid to have these characters be both deserving of sympathy, but also capable of being really, really awful. Some of these characters, they're obsessed with class and wealth to a degree that is gross. But Kwan doesn't try to lessen the severity of what they do or try to pull any punches. He really lets them kind of fully be consumed with their status, but also kind of give you little inroads into where they're deserving of empathy so that you kind of have something to latch onto with these characters. That aspect of his stories lets him talk about wealth and class in a way that I think is a little bit more complicated than just some sort of money corrupts kind of message. In fact, over the course of the series, money serves as a gateway to understand Chinese, Singaporean, and American families and history. And while I don't think Kwan is necessarily working towards like any particularly complex thesis about money and class, I do think that it's interesting to see how he builds these ideas over the course of the series. While I do love the world that Kwan is able to paint in these series, where it starts to sort of fall apart for me is the story. There is some kind of story in the series, but I think it's lost in some really weak writing. When we talk about books like Crazy Rich Asians, which are like, you know, these kind of poppy, chick-lit-y kind of books, I think it's really easy to be dismissive about writing concerns. Like, it feels like you're just being overly nitpicky to point out weaknesses in writing. And so I sometimes feel uncomfortable when I start delving into what is often just like my particular pet peeves. But I'm going to go through some of these writing issues anyways, not because I think they hold the book back from any height that it's not aspiring to, but because I think it's actually keeping the book from achieving like the basic level of its ambition. And one of my biggest issues in the book is the dialogue. And what that comes down to is the fact that the characters in this series often feel like exposition bots. It kind of seems like Kwan is uncomfortable telling the story in any sort of general narrative form. Kind of like an extreme take on show don't tell. It's not that he won't use just kind of general narrative form to do it, it's just that whenever he can, it seems like he prefers having the characters tell you the story instead of actually acting out the story or experiencing it. For example, characters are not described in any kind of general paragraph form. They're described often in dialogue between two other characters. And obviously that's not like unrealistic. People talk about people. People will talk about how other people look and their backgrounds. You can use characters to talk about other characters, but Kwan basically does it all the time, to the point where the dialogue is meant more to explain the plot than to actually advance it. In addition, because the characters are all basically kind of thin veneers for the same purpose, they all start to sound stiff and extremely similar, which sort of lessens the vividness, I think, of their portrayal and their kind of interior thought processes. Related to this is a more minor pet peeve of mine, which is Kwan's tendency to switch between multiple points of view very abruptly. Like, one paragraph you might be reading from like Astrid, one of Nick's cousins. The next paragraph you'll be hearing from like her aunt. It's very abrupt. There's no transition. You just immediately go from one character to another with no warning. And when you do that, I think it's harder to get a sense of any one character, and so they all sort of start to blend together. This is a technique that Celeste Ng does in her books to create a deliberately disorienting atmosphere. In this book, it's just accidentally disorienting, and thus weakens the story overall because you don't really ever feel like you have a handle on any one character. There are a lot of characters in this book, and I love the idea that there are a lot of characters because they are all super fascinating. Unfortunately, I don't think Kwan is quite up to the task of weaving together all the stories that he wants to tell about these different characters. The first book is the most focused of the books. It's very much centralized around Nick and Rachel, and so it has the strongest sense of stakes. In the later books, as he starts to build out the number of characters that he's really trying to tell you stories about, the sense of stakes starts to feel much more dilute, and the plot overall feels much more just like rich people exist. And that goes even in stories that theoretically do have a strong sense of stakes. Like, you know that they're there, but because it's not really fully explored in the story, they kind of just feel very like hand-wavy. I think Kwan also doesn't have a very strong handle on tone. Well, I was comparing this in my head really strongly to the Gossip Girl books, which I think, whatever you want to say about them, they have a very strong sense of voice, and when you read them, you feel like the author at least knows what the book is that they're writing and what it should sound like. These books felt much more uneven in that regard, and that especially came out in the second and third books as he started to use footnotes in ways that were really infuriating. So the first book has footnotes. They're usually for like cultural notes to explain things in different languages, things that an audience who doesn't live in Singapore might not know about. So they're handy notes, and he might have a few kind of snarky comments in them, but for the most part, they have a clear sense of purpose. In the second and third books, he started using them a lot more to insert like pop cultural references and stuff, and I just found it distracting, both from what little story there was and also from what little tone there was. Also, the third book has like a random Nigel Barker cameo, which I guess is probably because Nigel Barker may have helped him learn a little bit more about the worlds he was talking about. I'm not sure, but it was weird. Like, I don't know. I've been on like an America's Next Top Model like rewatch binge recently, and I'm just like, what the fuck is noted fashion photographer Nigel Barker doing in these books? The pop culture references were frustrating to me, not because I don't like pop culture references. I love pop culture references, but I think you need to first make sure that your story is strong enough before you start to work in other elements like an America's Next Top Model photographer cameo. I am complaining a lot about this book right now, but I will say, like, there are characters in this book who have a lot of promise. One of my favorites is Astrid. She's Nick's cousin, and she has this sort of like weird relationship, I think, to her wealth and just her family that over the course of the series takes on really fraught connotations as she's trying to figure out questions about her marriage. I really loved her story, and I loved her as a character. And on the other hand, there's Kitty Pong, who's this soap opera actress who's like trying to worm her way into upper class society, who I also loved reading about. I just loved all of the ideas of these characters. I just think they needed to be fleshed out a little bit more. But because I love all of the ideas that are in this book so much, I'm really glad I read them, and I would recommend them, just with kind of a lot of those caveats. I'm also really excited for the movie adaptation because I actually feel like it might be able to address a lot of the issues I'm describing in this review. The characters are inherently going to be much more vivid because they're on the screen. The plot will probably be a little bit more streamlined and focused because time constraints. And I think because you're working in movies, there's a lot of other aspects in the form that you can rely on for exposition, like, you know, visual aids and stuff. So I'm hoping it won't be as reliant on dialogue to tell you everything that's going on. And I'm hoping that means that the dialogue will also then be a little bit less stiff and will also serve the characters a little bit better. So again, while I am issuing a lot of complaints about the writing and how I think that shortchanges the story, overall I did really love these books. I think the world is fascinating. I think the characters are so much fun to read about. And while this might seem contradictory given that I'm complaining a lot about the story, I do think that there is a satisfying arc over the whole series. I don't think it's necessarily executed as well as it could be, but I think it will still be fun for you to read if you think you're in the mood for books like these. So give it a chance. I'm super excited for the movie. I will probably talk about that when it comes out. Oh, I'm so excited. There's so many good movies coming out this year. So yeah, thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you thought of Crazy Rich Asians below, and yeah, bye.